We've always been populated by people with curious minds, intent on inquiring, exploring, discovering and sharing. And today, we are still passionate as ever about sharing our science with wider society. What we do is not just for the lab and for the library, for awards ceremonies, for academic league tables, although, all of that is good and we have to do that. But we do it for the benefit of society. And that statement, to work for the benefit of society, has been in our mission statement right from the outset. And it's there for a reason, not because it just looks good or sounds right, but because an institution that doesn't engage with the world can never inspire the world. And we're here to inspire people, and we're here to change the world. We hope that sharing what we do can make society better, but it certainly makes us better. It's how we can test our quality, measure our impact, and earn our reputation as a world-class scientific institution. For us, sharing must be an important part of what we do. Whether we're talking about the challenges that affect our planet, more about this shortly from another passionate institution next door, our postcode, talk to our neighbours in White City, whether we're giving patients the power to shape their treatment or letting local school pupils remind us what wonder really looks like. Whatever we're doing, we want people to try it, touch it, maybe even taste it, certainly test it, and tell us what they think. And there's also a broader context beyond the altruism that clearly lies at the heart of so much of the engagement work that you're all involved in on a day-to-day basis. There are other drivers from funders and policymakers. And we're going to be addressing this in our panel discussion at the end of today, where Paul Manners, the director of the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement, will be joined by Stephen Hill, who's Director of Research Policy at Research England, and Professor Nick Jennings, our own Professor Nick Jennings, who's Vice Provost for Research and Enterprise. And I'll be there just to make up the numbers. But of course, today is not just about you sitting and listening. In truly engaging style, we want your input. So we're running 4 breakout workshops, and hopefully you've already signed up to those, indicated which ones you're attending. If not, then please do so. And you'll have the opportunity to get involved in discussions about the language we use when we communicate about science, or working with schools or policymakers, or how we can use science capital as a lens to reflect our own activities and events. I'm really sure that these are going to be very stimulating and thought-provoking sessions. We also want to showcase some of the amazing engagement that goes on here at Imperial College from right across the college. And it's a strategic priority for our leadership. You only need to see what's happening, what's going on with our local community out at White City campus, or visit our annual festival. And this year we had about 23,000 people registered for the festival. It is actually mind-boggling the number of people that we reach through that festival. So much goes on a day-to-day level, led by you. So we're going to hear from 4 inspiring practitioners in our fast-paced Pecha Kucha style presentation style. I don't know if any of you have ever seen these Pecha Kucha sessions, but I really take my hats off to those individuals that have volunteered for this activity, because it's quite challenging. So we'll see how they all perform. No pressure, guys, in the audience. And obviously, we're going to have sessions where you can network, get to know some of your colleagues who work in engagement, including members of my own team who are here to help over a bite at lunchtime or over tea this afternoon. But now it's my real pleasure to hand over to Clare Matterson, who's Director of Engagement at the Natural History Museum, so just down the road. Clare's talk is entitled Nature in Crisis, the Role of the Natural History Museum. Clare has an amazing CV when it comes to engagement and has been a real leader in this field. So we are truly honoured, Clare, that you're here to open our first engagement day. Claire's worked at the Wellcome Trust, the EAT Foundation, and now is helping lead the NHM through a hugely challenging period for institutions like ours, and not to mention challenging for our natural world. Clare.
But it was always there as a kind of passion, and I kind of got to the point in my career I suddenly thought, oh, and there hadn't been any, people were just told, this is going to be good for you, this is great. And there was this huge backlash from a variety, led by a number of, as I say, strong media, but coming from a number of different campaigning forces. And I think scientists were really taken aback by this. It was not really expected. It was not intended. But at the same time, the A-level entries to science, kind of in a different sort of section, actually had really come down. If you can kind of see the overall numbers there, in kind of 2000, suddenly across all of the major sort of scientific subjects, we were seeing real declines in the number of people coming in to do the kind of major scientific A-levels. So there was, in the Department for Education, there was kind of what is going on with science education more broadly, what is the relationship between science and society. Now there are many theses probably being written about that particular period at the time. But it led to a number of things. There was the very famous, if you've not read it and you're interested in this, it's still a good read actually, going back to the House of Lords report Science and Society. I mean, it was a very influential, very, very thoughtful report. One of the lines in it was something around how science needed to kind of find a new relationship and something like a new humility in terms of how it thought about its relationship, not just sort of talking at, and that sort of led to this concept of the rejection of the deficit model, that if you just kind of fill up with more facts, everybody will, or if you speak louder and shout a bit, everyone will kind of love the science. And there was kind of a rejection of that, i.e. that's sort of when we moved from that public understanding to public engagement. And very much then, I think science and scientific institutions, I think, responded incredibly positively to this. It wasn't, there were a few people that were kind of sort of holding their hands up, but I think on the whole, there was kind of a real sense, because, from scientists to kind of say, okay, and from major funding organisations, what does this really mean, and how can science be part of the debate? And there was a very influential moment at Wellcome when many of you probably know and hear Claire Fox on the radio, very sort of combative. We had her on one of our sort of advisory committees, and she just made the point, and she sort of said it very forcefully. She sort of said the debate is out there. It's not that the debate isn't happening. The debate is out there, and if you want to inform the debate, you have to be part of the debate. And it was kind of quite a pivotal moment. It's sort of simple, but a lot of people woke up. I think science hadn't really been part of the debate, thought it was slightly separate. So I think, where we are then and where we are to now is very, very different. And this led then to a much more kind of, what do we mean? What are the different modes of engagement? What do we understand by engagement? Is it just one thing? Is it many things? And this was the model that we used at Wellcome, and there's, the National Centre for Public Engagement, has something very similar to this, and so I think we've all kind of, come and sort of developed our own. But we kind of thought about engagement when I was there very much in these sort of three main modes, and we were really trying to understand and all are important. I think there was a bit of a danger at one point that the telling was a bad thing. I've never thought that the telling is a bad thing. Actually, I think it's a really important thing. But there are other, different modes do different things. And I think, how do we understand, what are we trying to achieve, and what are the sorts of modes? So there's very much the kind of the telling, the educating, the inspiring, and there's lots of fantastic ways of doing that. And then there are others, kind of how do we have more that kind of engaging, where you're kind of trying to perhaps get rid of, if you like, a sort of a power relationship more, and kind of really try to think of how can you come at this from, perhaps more sort of open, discursive ways, the opportunities for sort of questions in perhaps a more discursive rather than a kind of Q&A, in a lecture theatre. And there are a lot of different methodologies developed in terms of ways you could do this, consultation panels, etc., etc. And then finally, and it's probably still the least, there's more of the top one, a certain amount of the middle one, and less of the bottom one. But this sort of collaborating, citizen science sort of has become a little bit, on that. But there are other, particularly in the medical fields, there are quite a lot of different ways now of kind of involving patients in the development of research questions or the ways in which then research is understood. So there's a lot of examples in all of those. And I think that was really trying to understand and explore. So I think I would say there was kind of 10 years of really sort of developing that and developing those different models. So for me then, one of my roles at Wellcome was really to work, intensively with scientists and kind of really, this is all very well having this, but what does this mean if you're kind of, as a scientist, kind of sitting there and, talking about these different modes? And, I had some fantastic people that I worked with, and this is one of them. His name is Kevin Marsh. He's just retired, although he's still very active. He's professor at Oxford in infectious disease, but he spent a very, very large chunk of his career in Africa, in Kenya, running the Kemri Khalifi unit, which is a very, very large research centre working on sort of infectious tropical diseases in some of the sort of poorest communities of there are amongst the villages. The research centre is next to the district hospital, and then they work with all of the villages. And so he had to really think through, his research was, he needed people to be involved, otherwise the research couldn't happen. And I think really the development of their thinking about public engagement changed dramatically over the years, and we learnt a lot here from his experiences. And this sort of model that I'm about to put up, which is, how to talk to a scientist about why this is important, which is, slightly different, what it might mean for them, very much came from Kevin, and we kind of developed it and worked with him, and then we began to use this. So he would kind of say, and we were sort of set at the beginning, actually, because of the sort of research he did, there was a kind of must do. And for him, because he was doing this community-based, he had to be right in the community, he couldn't actually do the research unless he had it. Now, it's not the same for everybody, but there is, I guess, another layer of that when you perhaps a different kind of research, which is kind of about public accountability. If one is doing this on behalf of publics, there's a kind of, almost a sort of, one ought to be saying, what is it one is doing on behalf of that public? Now, it's a pretty high level, but you could kind of, I think, easily say, there's a duty, there's a sense that there's a sort of a must in here that at a certain level, it may not be a huge amount, but you must do it. But then talking with Kevin from his perspective, it actually became a kind of, this is really sensible for us to do. It isn't actually that we must do it, because otherwise we couldn't do research. It creates a positive climate, and he would say, actually, it improves your own research. There are many, many examples now of researchers, of scientists who said kind of that engagement has really made them think about the way in which they do research or the way in which they think about their research questions, and helped them to become what they would kind of say better scientists. And encouraging others, by that engagement, young people, whoever, to become scientists, putting that sort of public and human face to science. So kind of a sensible thing to do as a research leader, as a scientist. And then kind of, taking it perhaps to that bigger, not just about your institution, your lab, your kind of, how can you do better, but actually then standing back. And this is where, someone like Kevin, who kind of worked, I guess, more at that global level, you kind of say, that actually, there are some real big issues here. As if we do this, and we do this well, it can kind of mitigate risks of wider backlash in terms of why are we doing this, why does it matter, because we've actually got other advocates for us. It doesn't have to be us that speak up, but other people will speak up on our behalf. And the new technologies, the new developments, the new advances, a bit like that GM, it doesn't sort of come from nowhere. It kind of, it's sort of been discussed, it's been part of that kind of national conversation for a while. And there's kind of, it emerges in that kind of democratic process of sort of, where is our money going and what is it that we want, want to be done on our behalf. If people don't have a sense of what's going on, how can they sort of know what they are upholding? And a kind of a sense of equity in terms of, who is involved and how do you really broaden that sense out. So kind of, I would use this when talking to scientists, but I would say, because otherwise I think it would be very arrogant of me to kind of say this very much came from scientists, from Kevin, but from others talking to me, and then use this as a why might you, as a researcher, and then as you go through your career as a research leader, think that this is important. So then one of the things, this isn't necessarily linear, but one of the things that I think all that kind of sense of experimentation, working with different partners, doing engagement in different ways, kind of understanding nowadays, there are so many activities out there that are competing for our time. We have to do this stuff in a way that is really professional. It is really, that people could just go and choose to do something else. For me, it's kind of can't just be the sort of the hobby on the side. You've got to kind of think about it in a professional and serious way, both in terms of respect for the audiences, but also, if you actually want to get any audiences in the first place. So, all of that experimentation, working with organisations, with arts organisations, with broadcast organisations, with other kind of NGO type organisations that have audiences, that understand audiences, and how can we learn from them? And then for me, there was, we did a lot with many of these different things, and we brought a lot of this learning together to kind of set up Welcome Collection. I don't know if you've been to Welcome Collection on the Euston Road. It's a venue. It's about 12 years old now. And I was one of the founders of that. And we really thought carefully about what is it we want to do here. And we were aiming for something quite different. We aimed for an adult audience. It wasn't that children aren't allowed, but you as an adult kind of make the decision that they want to come. We aimed for that because we wanted to address some issues and some topics which I think are more challenging from that kind of health and medical end and sort of societal end. And actually some very practical reasons. We're stuck on the Euston Road and there's nowhere to, we didn't have a very big site and there's nowhere to put a coach or to have, kids changing, eating facilities, etc., etc. But, it was more from the mission, but it also worked in terms of the concept of the space and the building that we had. And we put on, I think, what people kind of felt was some sort of interesting, quite different, quite daring sometimes, and and there was a real thirst for it, showing that you can do engagement in lots and lots of different ways. And this was, to some extent, this example was kind of a more straight example, but it was a lovely example. It was looking back at the early crystallographers, and then the textile designers actually got really, really interested in the images that were coming out from that early crystallography. And then there was kind of an exhibition at this at the 1901 Festival of Britain. And, so how interesting is that? You actually look back at some of those textiles and they're incredibly beautiful. So this was kind of quite a straight sort of, historical but early kind of art and science coming together. But there were some beautiful stories of individuals, of how this happened and how this came together, and lots of interest. And scientists in particular really loved this one. This one kind of ticked lots of boxes for them. There was another one, very, very different, and this we called High Society, and we looked back and to the current day, at the kind of the societal, the scientific developments and understandings and the ethics and the political debates around the use of kind of mind-altering substances in history and in culture. This is one I wouldn't recommend that people brought their children to particularly. And what was so interesting about this one, we had many of our visitors who came to this, who took the top word high, literally, and came around the exhibition, clearly whilst experiencing some mind-altering. But what was kind of interesting, it just sort of showed that topic brought a very, very different group of people, where we could then actually kind of talk about some of these issues and expose some of the science to a very, very different group of people. So quite a different audience from kind of atoms to patterns. And then this was actually our opening show called The Heart, which was a beautiful show that really looked at the heart from science, from how we understand it, what we culturally, what we kind of put on the heart as meaning. And we had this fantastic moment, and this got a huge amount of press coverage, not surprisingly. So the young woman you see there, her name is Jennifer Sutton, and she had a full heart transplant about a month or so before the exhibition opened. And then she made this incredible recovery. We had a whole piece about the early heart transplant and how that all started, and we had a kind of set up in the exhibition. And then she came and looked at her own heart, and we had her own heart in the exhibition. So that was really quite a dramatic moment, and you can imagine it was a wonderful moment to get the media in. The media loved it, they loved her, and we couldn't have asked for someone that was more perfect for the media. She was sort of articulate, and she was, thoughtful, etc., etc. But it was a real opportunity and a real moment, and something a little bit different at that time. And then this one I mentioned because it sort of brought a very different dimension and had surprised us actually. This was an incredibly tough and moving exhibition which was called Life Before Death. And so these photographs that you see here, this was a photojournalist and a journalist partnership who talked to people who were in hospices who knew they were going to die, and then talked to them about their thoughts about death. Death is kind of, quite a taboo topic. It's not something we talk about, we open up about. And also had agreement with them that then, so that the photograph that you see is when they were alive, when they had that discussion. And then the next one is they agreed that as soon as possible after death, they would then be photographed as well. So you see them in alive and then sort of almost immediately after death. It was a really tough exhibition, as you can imagine. But what was really interesting about this one, it absolutely went viral as an exhibition. It went all over the world through social media, and because this is a very portable exhibition, and it just went touring everywhere, and it really kind of got people thinking about some of these difficult topics, and kind of really we were surprised at, I guess, how much interest and how many people really wanted to engage in this. So that was kind of my experiences of kind of trying to find different ways into difficult and interesting and challenging topics. So why the Natural History Museum? Well, I've given you a little bit of that background. My background in zoology, and one of the last things I did when I was at Wellcome was set up this initiative called Our Planet, Our Health, and which was really looking at that intersection between human health and the health of the planet. And the more I began to understand about it and read about it, the more I became kind of concerned, alarmed, depressed, whatever one wants to say. And I really felt that I wanted to sort of move into that different space, and spent a year or so doing some freelance work and working for a foundation in Norway that looked at food from the concept of sustainable and healthy food systems with kind of scientific underpinning, and then to the Natural History Museum. So as I say, you probably know, and you've got some fantastic research institutes here, that we have got a crisis in nature. You look at biodiversity loss, insects, vertebrates, whatever you want to look at. You look at the impacts of climate change, which I think we're all feeling more and more. You look at the long-term issues around food security, population growth, etc. We've got a problem with us humans on this planet. We are now in this concept of, many scientists call it the Anthropocene, i.e. the human activity has become the dominant force affecting and having an influence on climate and the environment, which is kind of a new state of affairs. And our health is a fantastic Lancet Commission done in 2015, one of the big kind of synthesis papers called Planetary Health. I think it's sponsored by Rockefeller, which really then shows how human health and the huge advances that there have been, say, in the last decades on human health could very quickly be undermined because of the kind of planetary effects that we will have across a whole series of issues. So why the Natural History Museum? So for me, it's kind of the cathedral of nature. I mean, it's iconic. It is this extraordinary, you go into that Hinsey Hall, and it's this extraordinary and beautiful space that I think, people have a connection with. And so I kind of thought, well, can we sort of, what can be done there in the context of these difficult issues? And this is where it's all questions. 2 months and 1 week in, it's all questions. So I got this experience, but it was coming from a slightly different place. And here I am now. And as I say, this place, is the opportunity of where can we think about that human relationship and that planetary relationship. And for me, never has that kind of, that reliance and that understanding. The planet, I think, will be fine. We might sort of mess it up. The planet will then probably carry on and do whatever it's doing. But, it's, if we want a prosperous, healthy, ongoing place on this planet, that's what we've got to. And then, this kind of sense that there's this sort of growing disconnect from nature, the greater urbanisation, etc., etc. Do we really have, and is there real evidence that there is this disconnect, and if so, what can we do about it? So these are the things I think I hear and I agree with, and everybody says, the doom and gloom kind of scenario, telling everyone how awful it is, and I've just done a bit of that, I apologise, is kind of paralysing. It hasn't worked. Many of the big NGOs kind of did that, and I think all of them are turning around and saying that wasn't the right answer. The kind of just seeing the polar bear on the shrinking iceberg. You kind of just have to distance yourself from it. None of us feel we can do anything directly about that. We know, right from the beginning, we know it's not the facts that necessarily change minds. We've learnt a lot through that public engagement that we've got in the past. So what is it that we think now can actually shift minds? And we know that climate scientists have actually had a really hard time. You know, there's been studies showing that of all the different scientists there, some of the scientists that actually have the greatest levels of anxiety, both because of the topic, but also in the way in which their work has been sort of pilloried in certain communities because it has such a direct impact on kind of social and sort of corporate and business norms, and even some of them who've actually have received death threats in their lifetime. So it's a kind of group of scientists. Now it's not just climate scientists. I think many scientists I think will and are increasingly getting into this space. So we know, and once again, it's kind of intuitive, we need to balance that kind of motivation, what can we do with the kind of, because there is a big problem. We need to think about the relevance, we need to think about, if we link this to health, will that be, is that something that can be a motivator? We need to think not just of problems, but of solutions. So, I think we all hear this and we kind of know this and this all makes sense. What's really interesting is that business and policy, and I've done a lot of work, as I say, with this organisation called EAT, business and policy, I think, are way ahead of where public engagement is and public is on this topic. I just came from a 2-day forum looking at the food system. It was full of chefs, business people, chefs who were really trying to think about sustainable food systems. It was you had the chief executive of the World Bank was there, thinking about this from kind of an economic perspective. We had the chief executive of Aviva there, saying from an insurance perspective, actually it's important for a long-term business aim in terms of, for them wanting to be around for the long term and trying to understand kind of insurance and insurance investment. So these players are active in this space, very, very active. And I think public engagement in this space is behind where business and I would say policy and scientists working with those are. So I come back to Natural History Museum. This is my problem, not your problem. Here we have this great trusted and loved institution, and therefore my questions are, what can we do with something like this? This is an institution which, I have a job there, but it sort of belongs to us all. And is this a sort of place where, there is kind of love and trust, as it were, that could help here? And I kind of put this in big letters because it's I don't think we can kind of hang around here. There's sort of a number of are we happy? Are we happy to say, well, let's hope we're wrong that, kind of the displacement of people from our increasing weather-related conditions is going to kind of make our current migration problems, just look like a walk in the park. It'd be great if we could say that we're wrong about that, but that's kind of a bit of hope. Should we say, well, I hope we're wrong that sort of sea level rise might kind of displace 1 billion people by the end of the century? I kind of don't want to just sort of hope that we're wrong. And sorry, I have to put my glasses on here. The climate scientist John Schulenhuber, he was the one that kind of, very influential, proposed the 2-degree kind of guardrail for global warming, and he was a guest speaker at a conference that was apparently called 4 Degrees or More, and he was asked this question, what is the difference between 2 degrees and 2-degree and 4-degree world? And let's hope we're wrong. His brutal and somewhat succinct reply was human civilization. So this is kind of this urgency that I kind of feel, okay, well, where does that leave us as sort of public engagers in this space? And that existing model that I put up, informing, engaging, collaborating, is that right for this challenge? And this is kind of one of my questions. These are some of the methodologies that we know, we have some understanding. As sort of science-based organisations, and we're not campaigning organisations, and I don't think we should be. A campaigning organisation does things differently, but as science-based organisations, what is the model we should be adopting? Is it motivating, advocating, changing? I don't know, but I'd kind of really be interested in who's done work on this, who's been thinking about this deeply. What are some of the best methods we know in terms of, in terms of what we might want to shift and achieve here? Is there a really strong research base out there that can help us?
into for many years, where I haven't been tempted to take out my iPhone and see who's messaging me, because it was such inspirational, captivating talk, and I think a lot of it resonates with us. I mean, the historical perspective I think is really important, and we must not make some of the same mistakes again. A lot of what you said resonates so well with what we're trying to do at Imperial, and thanks for the reminder about business. We'll make sure we sort that one out next time. Also, how very different and creative approaches can bring in really different types of people. One of the things we like to do is, as well as bring people here, go out to meet different people. And your footfall of 5 million a year is impressive, but it's minuscule compared to the footfall at Westfield, which is 28 million a year. So we need to be out
Absolutely.
in some of those other environments as well, doing this kind of work. So it was fantastic, and now there's an opportunity for other people to ask questions. So please, don't be shy. Just need the first one. Yes.
I wonder if you could say a bit more about how you find the balance between, you mentioned motivation and despair, so particular issues like climate change, how you approach trying to get that balance right?
Well, I mean, I haven't approached it yet, I guess is the answer, and that is but I do think we need more motivation than despair. I mean, I think there has been too much despair, and I think that has been perhaps part of the problem, and there's some sort of literature around that kind of cognitive dissonance piece of, it's too difficult, and also you feel slightly implicated, but you don't feel that there's much you can do with it, so actually you kind of just, you just carry on as normal because there's nothing. So I do think, the two big issues, there are many, but the two big issues are around, I think, probably in energy, where a lot of work has been going on, and there are a lot of solutions out there, and food, where I think is still somewhat just not understood in terms of the way in which food has such an impact on, whether we're talking about climate, whether we're talking about kind of nitrogen, phosphorus, whether we're talking about water, whether we're talking about land use, etc., etc. There's that, very a complicated system, but also huge implications on health. Huge rise in chronic disease in places that you wouldn't necessarily have expected it. And as there is the rise in the middle classes in places like China, more and more are sort of moving away from what is probably good for the planet, plant-based foods, into things, meat becomes the aspirational sort of thing to put in your diet. So there are things actually where we can actually begin to think, how can we shift locally, and then, I think things have to start local, and then how can that move out? How can we shift that kind of consumer piece? Because businesses will move, it's like, I don't think businesses will move only if consumers are going to move as well. So I think there are things we can do, particularly say in that food place, with we all love food. Well, I do. And so I think there are things we can do to kind of put that motivation in, working with, as I say, with chefs, with others, and then have some great science that sort of comes in and really kind of helps to sort of fill that picture out. So I think find our topics and then think about how can we show some of the positive aspects of that. So.
Other questions at the back there, yeah. Could you just wait for the microphone? Sorry, can't hear you down here.
Yes, I first wanted to thank you for, is this the turn on? Okay, thank you. I first wanted to thank you for the absolutely inspiring and eloquently delivered speech. My question is, which organizations do you think that scientists, such as researchers here at Imperial, should focus on collaborating with in the current day?
Ooh, that's a very tricky question. I think it depends for what purpose, actually, because there are so many, and it depends what it is you're trying to do, and possibly at kind of what stage you might be in terms of your career as well. So, there are a great many scientists I know now who are working and sometimes get criticised, but I think they've probably possibly reached the point in their career where they've got kind of broad shoulders and can kind of stand up that, working, with business, and really trying to engage with business. Some of the big businesses where that frankly we kind of wish that they would have a different business model, and really that engagement and that you can begin to see real sort of change and potential for the future. So that might be when you're at a certain point in your career, but that relationship, I think, in this dialogue with business is critical. But I think you've got to do it at a certain time with a certain confidence and the right level of support. At different times, we've got this fantastic museum next door. I think there is huge opportunity for all the way through from undergraduate to postgraduate, et cetera, to come and do some things next door with the museum to meet different publics, in different forms, in ways which, you learn a lot about yourself, you work with some interesting publics, you kind of, there's a kind of win-win going on there. So I think it sort of depends on the what, but in a way, everybody, kind of all got to play our part. And I guess that's where, people like sort of Maggie's role is very important in trying to kind of help guide and help people understand, where and what are the opportunities. Because I think it's very hard if you're just the sort of lone researcher and to kind of say, well, what can I do? And I think that's why I get back to that point about this isn't just a sort of amateur thing. This has to be quite a professional thing, and therefore people need to be helped to kind of, to make it so. Does that answer your question? It's kind of saying that there isn't a single answer. Yay! Share my research with the public. Fantastic.
And of course, we're running a lot of training sessions, engagement academy. So there's lots of opportunity actually at the college to hone your skills in this respect and see. And we can then connect you with other people as well to see, depending on what you want to do, who are the best people to work with. Any more questions? Yeah.
Hi. Thanks for your talk. I'm interested in your role related to engagement. To what extent do you see the Natural History Museum as having a role in listening to public audiences and understanding what their questions and attitudes are, as well as sharing information with them in all of the ways that you described?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because, the museum kind of, and that sort of museum's world is, if you look at that kind of engaging, sort of informing, engaging, collaborating, it does actually a huge amount, I would say, at that sort of informing, and actually does an awful lot of collaborating. Finally, there's a big kind of citizen science program, but probably does the least in that middle space. So I think that's an area that we need to do more. We've got about 300 scientists sitting there as well, and so Ian Owens, who I know has relationship here as well, have begun to have conversations about how do we think in a more structured way about our own scientists and their role in those three spaces. There is a bit going on at the museum in that space, but I think we could do more. It's more resource intensive because you end up having smaller numbers and and much more in-depth kind of ways of working. What there's been very little of, if not none, as far as I'm aware, of really kind of trying to understand what is it audiences want to see. It's been very much sort of dished up. And one of my questions back to the team is, have we ever done this kind of a certain amount of audience research and that sort of thing done? Do we know what people out there are kind of interested in? And there's, as far as I can tell, those questions haven't been answered. And I think they're some of the questions it would be really interesting to find out as well. So I think that's for me, that's a challenge I'm taking into the institution. Yeah. But if you look, we did I did quite a lot of work with Paul Manners, and we had a pub who I know is talking with you later. Paul's fantastic, and we did before I was in this role, when I was at Wellcome, we got all of the major sort of organisations from the professional organisations to the major museums to the the British Association of Science, etc. Kind of working in a network, and we did a bit of a survey to look at those three areas. And masses going in on that top one, and much less, kind of very much like this as you went through the three. So, you know, I probably have to be nice to the museum. It's not out there in terms of being unusual in that.
Anything further? No further points? Well, oh, yep, yeah, go for it.
Well, really interesting talk. I'm playing a bit devil's advocate. Oh, thank you. You've talked a lot about how to engage with people who are not scientists. How do you engage with scientists? Because as someone who does that and used to be a scientist, I still sometimes hear like, oh yeah, people are not going to get this. So it is true, as you said, that people still trust scientists. I would not be willing to see the results of the question, do scientists trust the public? And I think that's a big problem, because if you think your audience is too stupid to understand you, then there's a big communication gap. So how do you engage with them?
Yeah.
Apart from
No, a very good question. In a way, that was why I was kind of trying to show that slide really with Kevin, because that, you know, that, so several points to your answer. One, so those conversations with Kevin and really kind of looking at it from the perspective of, you know, how can one talk, and this is probably to some extent to perhaps some of the leaders of science, of why it might matter to you. You know, not you have to do it because. And that's that kind of, well, the must do, smart do, wise to do. And, you know, and there's nothing better than also saying people are smart and wise. You know, it kind of helps. But you know, there will be some people who still just do not believe that this kind of just you know, facts don't change minds. You know, and that we've sort of still got quite a long way to go there. So I think it's doing more of it, getting more people engaged, training, support, help. You know, it's all of those kinds of things. You know, taking people on that kind of that route through, starting young. I think, you know, my sense is some of the younger, you know, sort of postdocs that we worked with, in a way, kind of have a slightly different mindset to some of the sort of more sort of what I kind of call middle sort of career researchers. That was certainly the kind of face. And so this idea and this hope that perhaps maybe a sort of different, you know, different sort of culture, a different way of thinking about the world, because you've sort of been exposed to different things as you go through. I think the other, there is work on that which you might want to look at. So there was I can't remember the exact dates, but there was a survey that was done mainly led by the Royal Society, which asked that very question, you know, about scientists' attitudes towards the public as opposed to public attitudes towards science. And then it was redone a number of years later. And we saw a few shifts, and I can't remember the details off the top of my head, but we saw a few shifts in a number of areas. I think we were all a bit disappointed that there wasn't more shifts. But you know, many of the barriers, there were still many barriers around, you know, the need to publish and actually training was better. But institutional support, and I think institutional support has improved a lot. Time was one of the big issues in terms of, you know, scientists getting involved and engaged, having the right amount of time. So that question is often asked, and trying then to kind of tackle those questions. So I do think, you know, events like this, getting people engaged and thinking this is important from a young age, seeing that scientists don't have to do it alone. That, you know, there are, and it can be really fun actually if you work with different creative people. You know, it kind of opens up, you know, all sorts of different ways of thinking. So don't kind of thinking you have to do everything on your own. Sometimes you might do something alone. Sometimes it might be your science, but actually it's other people using it, and you can just be a kind of advisor. So I think just exposure.
Very good. If there are no further questions. Okay, so when Claire and I were chatting just before the lecture, Claire said to me, do we do enough together? Does Imperial do enough with the Natural History Museum? And I said no. I think there's so much we can be doing with each other, and I really look forward to working with you and the team and all of our staff here to develop those interactions. Please join with me again in thanking Claire enormously for such a great lecture.